if you view the world as a story being written by Hashem, then he can make events proceed in a way that have meaningful relationships to each other. And so there can be a sense in which it is appropriate that the earthquake happens following the turn to Hashem by the leaders of Israel, right? But you wouldn't say, okay, and like little spiritual emanations came from the tshuva of the leaders, and that produced vibrations on the ground, which caused an earthquake. That's just silly. And I think that there's ample evidence the Talmudic sages would agree that it's silly to talk that way. And they sort of parody that way of thinking in some cases. But what you can say is that there are a lot of things in the world that are grayer in terms of their relationship to each other. And we see this in a lot of contexts. We see in the Scroll of Esther, right? The Scroll of Esther is about a miracle, but the miracle is all about people doing things and talking to each other. And so something about the nis, the striking occurrence, is in the details of how the ripple effects of one conversation leads to another, lead to the unexpected, right? So Sancheriv ultimately goes down because his sons betray him and murder him. And that, I think, is showing us a little bit of the hint of how this flood mechanism there is a rationale behind it, meaning that if you talk in the narrative terms of Tanakh and you say the flood was a bunch of water coming and sweeping everyone away, again, wickedness, me stealing from my neighbor, murdering my neighbor, etc., you don't think that's going to produce more rain. But if you ask, how well do societies thrive and prosper if everyone murders and steals from everyone else? There starts to be more of a kind of a chokhmah to this, or wisdom to it, where you say, oh, actually, I think a society in which everyone is always worried that his neighbor is going to steal from him or murder him maybe doesn't have a lot of adaptability and resilience, when it faces difficulty, because people are always on the edge of just turning on each other and eating each other anyway. And if you're in that situation, then when you experience when a blow lands that's just a bit stronger than expected, it can bring the whole system crashing down. And there, I think we have a lot to hope for, practically speaking, meaning that we don't have to rely only on earthquakes in Iran or in Lebanon, right? We had little hints of this, here and there, during the last several months. Not long after the war started, there was this missile exchange between Iran and Pakistan, because it turns out there are these people called the Baluchis who live on both sides of the border and want some kind of independence. Right? Iran is the remnant of a Persian empire that actually is full of different ethnicities, full of different factions. There are a whole bunch of people in Iran who hate the government. There are a whole bunch of people in Iran who are not Persian and who maybe actually don't want to be part of a Persian-ruled remnant of a Persian empire. And not only that, it's not a very diverse economy. If somehow their oil and gas fields stop being productive, they would really be in a bad way, et cetera, right? Like, it's not so difficult to make up a whole bunch of reasons why maybe Iran could just collapse in on itself and start being in some kind of civil war, in some kind of economic collapse, in some kind of political upheaval and revolution that could change the regime. When you go over to Lebanon, Lebanon is still, although it's not a majority Christian country anymore, there still are a sizable enough minority of Christians who hate Hezbollah, even if they don't necessarily like Israel. Some of them do, some of them don't. But they certainly hate Hezbollah. And it may be the case that they're not willing to just go head to head with Hezbollah under normal circumstances. But if Hezbollah is trying to drag them or their country into a war with Israel, where Beirut is going to get annihilated, then maybe they, act differently. And there's a lot of factors like that where you start to consider, okay, is Hezbollah launching all of its rockets at us the only way through the mess? Or, before that happens, do they end up in a pitched civil war with Druze and Christians, et cetera, et cetera? So that I think is just pointing to the fact that it could be that keeping the Torah does put out kind of probing points of contact to discover those kinds of weaknesses in one's enemies, meaning that while it may be the case that we're not as easily going to trigger earthquakes by keeping the Torah in a way we can understand, it may be that if we keep faith with Hashem and fight wars according to the Torah and treat each other well according to the Torah, et cetera, that we become the kind of resilient and obstinate society that has some real density and stubbornness behind any punch that it lands. And I'm not even just talking about bombs or whatever else. I mean, that whatever we pursue in the sphere of policy, if it's really rooted in the emunah of Chizkiyahu and the emunah of Moshe Rabbeinu, if it's rooted in our commitment to doing what's right according to our Torah and our tradition together and treating each other that way, right? Taking care of each other that way, taking care of the weak in our society that way, then you have a society that takes care of its weakest members. One is responsible for the other. There's tremendous mutual love and mutual desire to help and protect. There's tremendous trust that leads to adaptability. There's tremendous intellectual depth that leads to ingenuity. And you set that against a whole bunch of other enemies around that maybe are more numerous, that maybe are more powerful in the sense of they have, a larger hinterland or more natural resources, or they can put more feet in boots if they're trying to call up, infantry, grunts, or whatever, or they have oil wells or whatever else. But all of those societies are full to the brim with people who are much closer to being willing to murder their neighbor over something small, because the ideologies that they are organized around, which are so unswervingly dedicated to the destruction of Israel, you can't create a society based on fanatical hatred of Israel, like with Hezbollah, like with Iran, like in Syria, et cetera. You go around with Hamas. You can't create a society based on that kind of fanatical, deranging desire to wipe out all the Jews and destroy Israel and not have consequences of that lead to a kind of rot in society that really leads fundamentally to weakness and destruction, right? It's not at the end of the day accidental that eventually the enemies of Am Yisrael always end up getting dashed on the rocks of history. It has to do with the fact that they are brittle, that they're vulnerable, and it comes from this internecine mistrust, right? Like the fundamental point where we're focusing on here is Sancheriv being murdered by his own sons, right? That at some level, this whole elaborate, ultra powerful, world ruling imperial system was operating in such a way that its leader can't even trust that his own sons won't murder him. And that's not actually an uncommon thing for great ancient empires. And it is always, when politics are involved, partly an issue that people, once they have power, they always have to worry about who else is trying to get it. But that, along with many other things, has to be taken into account at the end of the day. That, when you're asking about Noachic floods, when you're asking about things where tiny spark can ignite and burn down the whole system, which systems are susceptible to that kind of auto-destruct process? And I think part of the point hiding in the background here with this sort of the rationale or the wisdom of this kind of emunah is that if we just stand strong with Hashem and with his Torah, and the people in the world who are incensed by that, who are motivated at a deep level to disprove our thesis, right? To stand before the world and say, their God cannot save them, right? Someone who has that motivation it's not an accident that he's going to fail. It's a an understandable and comprehensible process that's part and parcel to the absolute rot of mistreatment of one person by another that will infect every level of that society. Because there's no such thing as a just, caring, adaptable, loving society that wakes up every morning as a collective and just can't think of anything else but killing off all the Jews. So, one way or another, whether because Hakadosh Baruch Hu wants to give us some unexpectedly favorable weather, or because of things that are much easier to understand about why Hezbollah, for all the rockets it may have, might be a few bullets away from collapse if they start putting the bullets in each other's heads over things that are none of our business to even try to understand. One way or another, if we stand for Hashem, with Hashem, and according to His Torah, and we do that in a way where we try to unite the society around rejection of foreign gods and a turn with expectation and with hope and with gratitude and with love towards Hashem, the God of Israel, the God of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, then we will be victorious, and the world will see one way or another that Hakadosh Baruch Hu can save us with His wonders any way that He wants, and He will ultimately always do so because we're His people. He put His name on us, and His name will not stay dragged through the mud forever.